Hi, I'm Mike Druckman from law firm Hogan Lovells. Want to thank the Regenerative Medicine Foundation and Bernie Single and the Wake Forest Institute for Regenerative Medicine for this opportunity to present to the World Stem Cell Summit. I'm happy to present my partners, Andrew Strong and Barry Bergdorf, who will be presenting biotech startups, formation, funding, and IP licensing. Just a quick intro. Andrew has seen it all in life sciences. He really knows what it takes for a company to go from startup to success. Among other things, he served as the general counsel and compliance officer for the Texas A&M University system, where he was responsible for crisis management and internal investigations for the system's 11 public universities, 7 state agencies, and health science center, and many other responsibilities. He was also the founding CEO of Kalen Biotherapeutics, which was a startup biotech spun out of the A&M system. And he successfully grew over several years and sold that. It successfully grew over several years and sold to Fujifilm and Mitsubishi. Recently, Andrew co-founded and presently serves as the chairman of K2 Biolabs. It's a drug development company accelerator for early stage biotech companies. And he is appointed to and serves as the co-chair of the Cancer Prevention and Research Institute's Product Development Advisory Committee. I could personally say that Andrew really knows his stuff and is really pragmatic and gives really important advice to early stage companies. Barry, like Andrew, has seen all angles of life sciences. He started his career as a business litigator. He became a corporate securities and M&A partner at a global law firm. He served as vice chancellor and general counsel of the University of Texas system. There, for over 8 years, he was a key member of the leadership team and oversaw legal, real estate, cybersecurity, IT, and technology transfer matters. He was also the first GC of Samsung Austin Semiconductor, which included work on the construction of Samsung's DRAM fabrication plant and several large equity and equipment financings. He's on the board of several life sciences and healthcare companies, including an AI-driven mobile app for advanced pathogen surveillance. And Hogan Lovells is really lucky to have both of them guiding innovators and leaders in the life sciences who are clients of ours, based on their deep experience, helping them anticipate and address key issues to help them come to success. So with that, I turn it over to Andrew.
All right, well, thank you, Mike, for that very nice introduction. And Barry and I, even though I'm an Aggie and he's a Longhorn, we still get along marvelously. However, we will see what happens next year when the Longhorns come into the SEC. So that'll be fun to watch and to experience. But we're going to break our presentation up over the next 45 minutes into really 2 chunks. One is launching your company and getting the wheels on, the frame, getting the car rolling. And then Barry's going to talk about how to build value in the company, which is really kind of the first major value point, which is bringing the intellectual property into the company, and then from there growing the company. And so we're going to kind of focus on those first couple of years from day 1 really to about 2 years into the company as you grow it and build it. And we have our experience in terms of being also inside the academic institutions and responsible for technology transfer. We've seen it from kind of the inside of the institutions. We've seen it from the innovators who are starting new companies. And we've also helped PIs inside institutions take technology out and start those companies up. So I like to say, when someone asks me what I do, I'm a startup lawyer, because I like to help innovators and PIs who are doing new things, novel therapies, take technology out of their institutions or create their own technology, and think about creative ways to, start the company, fund the company, bring talent into the company, and advance it into the clinic. And so that's really the key. here is to get your technologies into the clinic where you can actually test it on patients, and hopefully it gains traction with the investment community as well as the pharmaceutical community. And so we're going to kind of start at the very beginning here with this next slide, which is really kind of something that I learned early on when I was a CEO starting up a company. Is I wanted to do everything. I wanted to get out there quickly and, you know, try to conquer the world. But what someone told me, which was great advice, is that, you know, Andrew, it's not about the velocity, but about the trajectory. If you're not on the right launching pad, you know, you may go and have a quick demise. So you need to think strategically. But as I matured in my thinking, as we grew the company that we ultimately sold, you know, it's really about both. I mean, you know, you're in a race. Your velocity is you're in a race against your competitors to develop and advance your drug or your therapy with whatever funds you have in hand. And your trajectory is really hitting that value inflection point so that the next raise is going to be at a higher valuation of the company. And so we obviously want the therapies to be successful, and we want to be able to treat patients with, you know, very terrible diseases and help them have better lives. But the money fuels the company, and you want to build your investor base. You know, usually it's starting very early with family offices, friends and family, angel investors. Maybe you're getting some VCs that come in early, but more likely they are waiting to the end. And really in today's market conditions, it's very, very challenging for startups. And so you're going to have to advance the ball further into the process where you're effectively de-risking more of the company before venture capital will come into the company. And you really need something that's unique and novel. You don't want to be focusing in an area where you're just going to be a little bit better than your competitors that are out there. And so why don't we go to the next slide? And so here's kind of really the startup. You know, biotechs and cell therapy companies and stem cell therapy companies consume a lot of money and very early on. And so you could easily be out on day one needing to raise a couple $1 million to get you to that next inflection point. And one of the biggest challenges that you have on day one is that you don't know what the value of your company is. When you form a company, whether it's a Delaware C Corp, which is predominantly most of the biotechs are formed as Delaware C Corps, or an LLC, which is a limited liability company, we would counsel our clients, you know, based upon what their objectives are, whether or not it's going to be a Delaware C Corp LLC. One thing to keep in mind is that if you are a Delaware C Corp and you form that company on day one, you can take investment from foreign investors. LLCs typically not, unless you set up a blocker corporation. And that's primarily because the LLC will generate what some of you may already know is a K-1 IRS report at the annual after the year is up. And most foreign investors do not want to be subject to IRS, the US tax law. So we see a lot of companies being formed as Delaware C Corps. But there are ways in which to form a tax efficient structure. If you have a C Corp and you want to develop LLCs underneath that, it all depends upon how you're putting the company together and kind of what you see as the ultimate exit. I would say that if you're a services related company and you're going to be generating revenue and losses annually, that LLC is typically more often used because of the single taxation from an LLC up to its investor base. But we're day one, we don't have anything in the company. We formed a company on paper. It's worth nothing at this point. That's when you issue the founder shares, and that's when you are going out for that early money. And the early money usually comes in the form of convertible debt. And so what is convertible debt? It's basically a loan from investors to the company that says once you get to a financing, and usually it's a preferred stock financing, that debt will flip into preferred stock at a discount. So if our preferred stock financing were at $1, then the discount in a convertible note is usually, say, 15 to 20%. So the dollar for the new investors is really, if it's a 20% discount, 80 cents for the convertible debt investors who also have accumulated some interest along the way. This is a very easy financing. There's really two documents that are involved. There's a note purchase agreement, and then there's the promissory note. And we can do this very quickly and very efficiently. And really, I think it's more of the preferred route for a lot of the family offices and angel investors who just don't know how to value the company. And they're going to let someone else more experienced come in on a convertible financing to value the company. So the key terms that we usually focus on in convertible debt: maturity date, interest rate, discount, and then qualified financing. And that's really how much money do you have to raise in your preferred financing in order to convert that debt into equity. And then the last item is a price cap. We, from the company perspective, do not like price caps, because what that basically means is that when you do your financing, you're trying to set price cap is assuming that there's a value of the company of, let's say, $20 million. Well, if your financing is at 40 million, then that price cap is going to come into effect. It's going to effectively price the round for that convertible debt at almost half the valuation. So if it really protects the convertible debt investors for a runaway valuation, but it's harmful on the company because it creates more dilution that's going to hit the current founders. And so if you're a founder, you do not like price caps, stay away from them. So we also like to think with our early companies in terms of a 3-year horizon, kind of what are the key events that occur. And as you develop your technology, if you're 18 months out from INDs, when's the IND going to be filed? What are the triggers that would get you there? Because this is going to play into your use of proceeds and when you time your convertible debt financing versus when you do your preferred equity financing. But I always say, think in 3-year horizons. And, as Murphy's Law always goes, things take longer than that. So 3 years is really kind of best case, but it really helps you kind of plan out how much capital you're going to need to raise and where those valuation or de-risking inflection points will occur. Next slide. All right, so dilutive and non-dilutive funding, it's pretty typical. Everybody knows what dilutive means. It means that if you are a founder or a group of founders, you own, say 100% of the company on a partially diluted basis. If you create a equity incentive plan, let's say you're 20% to the equity incentive plan, which is really stock options that you can award to future employees or non-statutory options or other options that are related to incentive stock options, ISOs. So ISOs and NSOs are the two types of stock options that you have. But really, dilutive means when you do a financing, you're being diluted. Your ownership interest is being diluted. Now, money's coming into the company, so arguably the value or the post-money value of the company's up. So, I always say dilution is inevitable. Your focus should be on pre-money valuation, not so much, how much you're being diluted. And really, the price per share of a company stock is really what the investors are willing to pay. And so, don't look, take in all offers, but ultimately you want someone who's going to be sophisticated enough to price your offering so that you can minimize the amount of dilution. And that's one of the toggles that occurs in a negotiation on a preferred financing. Non-dilutive is the best money you can find, right? I mean, it's, U.S. government funds, NIH, BARDA, DARPA, DOD, state funding. In Texas, we have the Cancer Prevention Institute of Texas. So if you have an oncology asset, CPRIT is really a great source of potential funding. If you're in California, well, actually, you don't need to be in California to get access to CIRM money from the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine. These are all great places that you should pursue, but there's usually strings attached that can slow your progress, or you have to add or bolt on things to your company. And then venture and secured debt is another way to achieve non-dilutive financing, but there's going to be negative covenants and positive covenants that you have to make in any type of debt financing, and you're going to collateralize your IP. Next slide. So early days of the startup, and Barry will go into this more as to the IP, but you know, your first value in the company is going to be its intellectual property. So when you're starting up that company on day one, it's worth nothing. You issue the founder shares, which are valued at, you know, basically 0.0001 cent per share. And so you may get 1 million shares and write a $10 check to the company because you're buying those shares. So, but there's really no value in the company at that point. When the value comes in is when the IP is dropped into the company, whether it's patents, subject technology, which is know-how predominantly, or anything else of value in the company that you can, that someone would look at and say there's value. People supplement value, but they don't create value. So a management team, a great management team, in and of itself without IP is worth nothing. But once the IP is there and you have a great management team, now you're going to be viewed differently. One of the things that we would say early on is make sure you're focused on getting your website URL reserved, getting your naming down, trademark, make sure all that's clear, because you don't want to change the name of the company, you know, in midstream after you're already up and running. And then once you have the IP, the technology advancement is key. And so whether it's, you know, IND, preclinical studies, clinical data, all this stuff is creating value for your company. And as to the last bullet on CROs and CDMOs, we would, you know, make sure that you know, if you're going to do your manufacturing yourself, that's going to be a huge capital cost to you to develop your own GMP facilities. If you're going to do your own preclinical studies, if you have a vivarium, those are all things that you need to balance. You know, what's the right deployment of your capital early on. Next slide. All right, so management team and board of directors and SAB, you will be you're competing with others to raise capital at this point. So your management team, you know, if you're a scientific founder, you know, at some point in time, a CEO who knows how to raise capital or a CFO who knows how to raise capital is going to be key to the company's success and advancement. Having a really good board, people that are directly plugged into the lifeline of the company and understand where it's going is going to be super important. So, you know, sometimes people will start with a 2-person board. As scientific founders, we say, go find the best person in this space that you know of and you trust. A board member is different from an SAB member. An SAB member is just kind of dropping in, you know, ever so often to give their counsel and advice and their thoughts as you present it to them. But a board member has a fiduciary duty to the company and to the shareholders of the company. And so you want people that you can trust, that you know you will get along with. We've seen a lot of disputes at the board level that is highly distracting to the progress of the company. And so we really want all the board members to be, you know, of like mind if possible. The leadership team, you're going to start building your preclinical team and your clinical teams, the CMC and regulatory components. These are all things that you should be thinking about very early on. And then public relations, and this is probably a little bit down the road, but when you go and start pitching your company, even to family offices, and you have a pitch deck or what we call a teaser deck, they're immediately going to go to your website and they're going to check you out and they're going to go to your LinkedIn site. And so you want to make sure that everything is seamless and you have a constant look and theme of your company, that you look professional, you are professional in the way that you engage with these investors. And then, you know, you have to be able to respond to market opportunities. As the CEO or leadership of this new company, you have to be able to talk about your competition. Any investor worth their salt is probably going to know more about your competition if they're investing in cell and stem cell therapies. And you've got to be prepared to respond to them and why you're unique and different. Next slide. So off the ground and running, early financing. We've talked about the convertible debt financing. And now we're going into our first equity financing. And so this is going to occur after your IP's in the company and you've built some momentum, you've got a team together, and now you're going to do Series C or Series A preferred. And really what that means is that there's effectively a liquidation preference for the preferred investors, and they will get other rights. They may get board representation rights. They may get other voting or veto rights in terms of things that the company can do. So the preferred stock is always going to sit on top of the common. And one thing just to keep in mind, this is going to kind of valuation. When you hear 409A valuation, that really refers to a valuation of the whole company as if it's common stock, right? And so that number is typically going to be 10 to 15% of what your price per share is that you're selling this preferred stock at. So post-money and pre-money valuation is always tied to that preferred stock valuation. So you may be a $20 million company going into a preferred financing, you raise 20, now you're a $40 million company. Well, when your 409A valuation comes out and it says you're a fraction of that, don't be alarmed, because really that's the 409A valuation is used to set the strike price for your stock options. And so we like to keep that number as low as we can so we can issue stock options to the employees and the management team and the board members with low strike prices. And so just make sure to keep those two things in mind. There's the preferred financing valuation or the company valuation, and there's the 409A valuation. There are two different things. Why don't we go back one slide, please? And so also want to just talk about investment brokers. So a lot of people will, if they don't know the market in terms of who would invest in my company, because right now at the Series C and the A round, you're typically looking at, beyond family offices. Now, family offices may follow a lead or a venture capital lead, but you're looking at VCs or strategics at this point. And sometimes you'll have to hire an investment broker. And so they always want cash, they want success fees, and you want to make sure that you're talking to people who are FINRA registered brokers. And so that's very important, because you may talk to someone in another country and they're going to go raise money for you. Well, if they're not FINRA registered, they cannot raise money in the US for you, and they cannot raise money from a US resident. But they can do it in other countries. You just need to be careful on these investment brokers. And we've done a lot of work on the front end of these engagement letters with brokers, and we've also fixed bad engagement letters with brokers. And so it's something just to be mindful of. All right, let's go to the next slide. Thank you. All right, and then the subsequent financings are Series B, Series C, and you're usually at a ratchet point going up. The goal is that the price per share is continuing to increase as you go to these subsequent financings. And then you're looking at possibly the public capital markets, whether it's an IPO, where you go in and you initial publicly offered shares, or what we refer to as a D-SPAC, which is now kind of, we saw a huge number of D-SPACs in 2020 and 2019. It is 2020 and 2021. It has clearly slowed down in 2022. And then we're also seeing a lot of M&A activity where we're doing business combinations. And so those are kind of ultimately your goal. Or if you're going to build that company, you need to be raising a lot of capital to build your company. And then also partnering and joint development. So you can continue to grow the company with preferred financing, which is dilutive, or you can look at other ways in which to exit the private capital markets, go into the public markets, or raise capital with upfronts through joint development agreements, partnering agreements with pharma. And then I think I've already raised, the timing of the financing. This is why that 3-year plan comes back into effect, because if your timeline slips and you're running out of money, and usually you need at least a 9 to 12 month cash runway when you start your financing, because you have to assume that your financing is going to take 6 months. I've heard clients say time and time again, "Oh, we got the money locked up. It's coming. We'll have it by the end of the month." It's just not. It's not that easy. It's very challenging to raise capital, particularly in today's market conditions. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Barry here, who's now going to talk to you about building that value through licensing.
Thanks, Andrew. And so as Mike referenced and Andrew said, Andrew and I, this is our practice area of taking companies from conception to idea to building a company with value in it. And we've kind of divided this up today where Andrew spoke a lot about funding and building that value as you move. And I'm talking about the licensing piece of it. So 2 points I want to make before we launch into the specifics here. Number one, that's a bit of an artificial separation, because as you're funding the company, as you're building that value, in parallel, you're putting together your intellectual property portfolio, giving you the platform and the freedom to operate. And so that's an iterative process. As you pull those pieces together, you are building that value and you're getting to those inflection points that Andrew talked about. So this is the main way you do it in a life sciences company. It's also the case that what I'm going to talk about today is really pulling those pieces together and pulling those pieces into your company, and not about out licensing, which is a way to extract value. So I'm talking to you, that's a whole other presentation. You know, one of the value creation models that we talk about a lot is the goose and the golden eggs. You have a platform, which is your goose, and then you out license or partner out specific indications, treatments, or therapies as your golden eggs. So like I said, that's a whole different presentation, but what we're talking today is building that value through your IP portfolio. And I really think the analogy I like to talk about here is the jigsaw puzzle. You know, as you build that value, as you get to that full picture, you're putting those pieces in. And when you insert that last piece, you get the full picture of the value of your company. And what you hope is that it's a beautiful vista of the Rocky Mountains and not some, you know, I'll make fun since I'm a Texan and a lifelong Texan and I love Texas, but some sagebrush in West Texas. That's not what you want your picture to be. You want it to be that beautiful vista of the Rocky Mountains. So, and the final general point is that, you know, you're here at this point and may be interested in this presentation because you've got an idea, you've got a piece of technology that you've identified, that you developed yourself, or you've identified that you're going to grab from someone else and build on it. That's just the beginning. You can't be myopic about your IP strategy and building that value. You've got to look at what comes next and how we round out that picture. So the goal of your company as you build these pieces is, as Andrew talked about, your funding, which is generally that series preferred funding that comes along, the non-dilutive piece, which is a great piece to have. And you know, you look at that just like you look at any cap table. You want to build your capitalization table with a combination of equity, different kinds of equity, some debt, and some non-dilutive funding, which doesn't dilute the other members on the cap table, and that's why it can be so attractive. Now, there is one trade-off there that we've got to talk about, and that is that when you're going to these non-dilutive sources, whether it be a private grantor, the NIH, CPRIT in Texas, whatever this state, local, federal, global funding is, who will fund some things, there is a control factor that comes with that. So you're not diluting anyone else on your cap table, but there are some strings attached. So, you know, you just want to very carefully assess those strings and understand where they're coming from. And then ultimately you go to an IPO or an exit through acquisition or merger or a SPAC, as Andrew said. So with that, we can talk about how we use the licensing strategy to get along that curve as we build the company. So first off is the identification phase. We want to identify the business critical IP that we need to obtain. And then we look at the sources of where we're going to get that from. If it is as much, especially in stem cells these days, much of the technology is originating, coming from out of the labs of universities. And you yourself, if you're starting one of these companies, you may be a professor, a faculty member, research scientist who is going to take this company out and devote a portion of your time to building a stem cell company. Or you may be a prior funder of some laboratory research at a university, and you've identified a professor in his lab that you are going to pull out and turn into a commercial aspect. So if you are dealing with a university, that's going to bring a whole set of considerations that we need to think about. We're going to talk about in a minute. And then obviously this relates very much to your budget and your funding that you're going to need to get. What is it going to take monetarily to secure your IP? And what are your further transfer abilities? Are you going to need to sub-license this? Are you going to need to enter into joint ventures and partnerships to develop this IP? And so what rights do you need to further deal with, transfer, segment that IP to execute on your strategic plan? So with that, we can now talk about that particular issue I talked about with universities, and that is getting in with the tech transfer office. Almost every major university these days, and some that are not major universities, have established a tech transfer office. And this is, I always say, when I was at University of Texas System and I had oversight for our 14 different tech transfer offices across system, including the medical institutions and the academics, the folks who head those offices, they really do have a hard job, because those above them are always changing. The president of the university changes, the provost changes, the vice president of research changes, and they have a new focus or a different direction they want to take it in. And so it is a bit like an aircraft carrier. You can't turn these tech transfer offices on a dime, but yet they're always being asked to turn them on a dime. And then the second part of it that makes it a difficult job is they're completely judged in hindsight. You know, if you licensed out the next Google, you're a hero. If you licensed out Ogle, which didn't make it,
Or you give away Google.
or you give away Google, you're judged. So it does create a real gun shyness, a hesitancy on tech transfer offices to do the deal. So you need to be prepared. It is a relationship you've got to build. You've got to work through the process. You've got to get them to the result, and you've got to align the interests so that when you win, your technology wins, your technology makes it to the marketplace, to the bedside, that this tech transfer office also wins. So I really emphasize that, because I see a lot of companies in dealing with these tech transfer offices not paying attention to the relationship part of it and just saying, okay, let's negotiate a term sheet. You got to go a little deeper than that. And it starts with, if we could go back one slide real quick, it starts with looking at every university has its IP policy, and what split it gives the individual faculty members, where the proceeds go, how it gets treated, things they can and can't do. They're written into the rules. So you really need to get your counsel or you or whoever is in charge of this to understand the particular university. What is their policy? And don't go to the table proposing something that they're never going to allow because it's in their policy. And then you've always got, again, the last point is really just a reiteration of everything, is you're really looking to strike a deal that aligns your interest as the company with the tech transfer office, with the interest of the overall institution, and then with the principal investigators who are involved. And there are lots of ways to incentivize and monetize the participation of the principal investigators, from consulting agreements, employment with the company, a split of the proceeds, sponsored research agreements to further develop the IP. All of those things are tools you can use, but you do have the overall job of balancing all four of those interests to get a deal done. And now we can look at, this is just a chart we've put in here to kind of show you. There are the big boys and girls in this game and everyone else. And you can look here, if you look at the revenues from IP licensing to these tech transfer offices, you get into some really big players. Now, it's a little bit unfair. My former employer, University of Texas System, is on here, and they're far and away number one. It's the system. It represents all those universities. So it's a little bit unfair to compare those to one individual institution. But the same is true for California System, Stanford. There are the known places that really do this. And so one of the points in putting this slide up is, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, about rounding out your IP portfolio. if you look at, if you think, okay, geez, I need this, I have this, but I need this piece, this puzzle piece that fits in and increases value, gives me more freedom to operate. Right here on this chart, these are the places you can look because they've got a vast inventory. And for every application, for every indication that you may be considering, there is somewhere at a US university that specializes in that and has a faculty member who devotes their life and their hours in the basement lab to figuring that out. So you just got to find that person, and chances are you may find it at one of these places listed on this chart. So then we can talk about the key considerations when you're negotiating this license. So at a base, it's patents, right? So oftentimes the university or the inventor of the patent, it's not always a university, but they will have already filed a patent. So then the question is, when you license that patent or the rights to the patent, what is the remaining life? So one of the things we do a lot for our companies is we engage in, not Andrew and I, but our colleagues who are intellectual property lawyers, do the IP diligence. What is the life of that patent? Where has it been filed? Is it global at this point? What does it actually cover? What are the competitive threats to that patent? What is it going to take monetarily to maintain that patent? Do we need to continue it, divide it, expand it? Do we need to look at new patents to surround it? And who's going to take on the responsibility of all that between the inventor and the company that is now licensing it? But the other point that really bears a lot of thought is the patent is not the end all and be all. It is the foundation, but you got to put the second and third and fourth story on top of that. And a lot of times that's know-how. You know, how do you actually make this compound in the lab? How do you make it in commercial quantities? What do you need to add to the patent to really make it commercial in application? Are there manufacturing patents or manufacturing technology that is going to be need to take your drug into the marketplace? And so also copyrights. A lot of times with an algorithm, if there's an algorithm embedded in the technology that tells you how to analyze an assay or something like that, it can be, it's written expression. An algorithm can be protected to some extent by copyright. Trade secrets, you know, all those things. You need to look at the full intellectual property portfolio when you're considering how to get this license. What else do you need to get with it? So the basic economics of a license, you know, this has been happening for long enough. Your standard license agreement, it's got these standard components. And so it really comes down to the dollars. So upfront licensing fee from a university, that's usually going to be all their sunk patent cost and maybe something extra. Back to that philosophy and that mindset of tech transfer offices, they like to show an early win. Now, if I'm the company or an investor in a company, I want to defer payments until I have revenue to support those. Well, what that means is you've gone through phase 3 clinicals and you've got an FDA approved product, and then you get to revenue. So revenue is probably 7 to 10 years away. You're not going to defer it all to then, but investors in your company do not want to say, I'm giving you $30 million to get into your phase 1s. Oh, and that generates a milestone payment of $2 million back to the university or the inventor. We don't want our money to go back into sunk cost. The investor wants the money to go into getting through that phase 1, phase 2, and moving down that value curve that Andrew talked about so much. So development and sales milestones are the next big thing. Again, you want to push them as far as you can into the future when you have revenue to support those. University wants to pull them as much into the present so they can show those early wins. A royalty, that's not very controversial because it is a percentage of net sales. There are a lot of people will talk a lot in negotiations about the definition of net sales, and that's something that really I just prefer to let the accountants handle because it can be mind-numbing at times and soul-destroying when you think about how to craft a perfect definition of net sales, but that's the big issue. And then, of course, what is the royalty? And that's really going to depend on the technology and the market potential of this drug. I always like to negotiate royalties which are cliffed based on net sales. So there is a difference between having a $1 billion drug and a $5 billion drug. So I don't want to be paying that higher royalty rate all the way up to $5 billion. Maintenance fees, that's easy. That's just what it takes to keep your patents going. And then finally, Andrew mentioned it, and I mentioned it earlier, your sub-licensing rights. I mean, you really got to think about what your strategy is. And sometimes some universities and others will get finicky with you on this about controlling your sub-licensing. Man, if you know you're going to need to sub-license and maybe sub-license several tiers down to get things done, you know, you don't want anybody back in the chain of the license holding you up and preventing you from doing what you need to do to make this work. You've also got your IP prosecution strategy, and this is something you really, really want to. The company has the most commercial interest in this. You and your counsel want to control that. You want to make the decisions based on when we're going global, what markets we're pursuing it in, whether or not what we're going to do about China, et cetera, et cetera. And then I also mentioned very briefly sponsored research. You know, to support the growth of your IP portfolio, you want to be looking, and I think sometimes I do have clients who kind of hesitate and say, I don't want to throw any more money at this. I mean, if you throw the professor's lab or a companion lab or even a competitive lab at another university, throw them $100,000 for sponsored research in this area. It is a great way to build goodwill, and is you never know what serendipity is going to come out of it that really could support what you're already doing. And I guess my you know, to use the analogy here, don't be penny wise and pound foolish by not saying I'm going to throw a $50,000 or $100,000 sponsored research agreement at someone, which could really increase the value of my company quite exponentially. Okay, so then we want to talk about existing and current IP. You know, you do need to do a competitive analysis, understand the priority date of your IP and what competitive threats may be out there, who really is the first to win this race, the IP race, which our IP brethren talk about so much, and really delve into what's disclosed in the patents that are competitive and in your own patents and what the claims are. And you also want to talk about how we're going to get from point A to point B with our prosecution strategy. And then on the back end, when do your claims expire? When does the license terminate? It usually terminates when the claims expire. Now, one point I want to make here, and I want to give a shout out to our host and moderator and guru, Mike Druckman. One thing I talk to people who do what he does a lot, which is so vital to our practice, is how could we get some regulatory exclusivity to extend our patent life or to sit parallel to our patent life in case our patent never gets invalidated or ever gets challenged? Could we have some regulatory exclusivity alongside that? And that can be a huge value creator. So that's really not on this slide, but I just wanted to mention that as something that you really need to be thinking about again. That is a great way, and I'm seeing more and more of it in today's companies. And then finally, you know, you look at this whole patent strategy geographically, globally, where can you get this exclusivity and where are claims pending? So, so just a couple other key considerations as I wrap this up, and I think Mike has a couple questions here. You know, key definitions in your license agreement, the licensed product. How people think, oh, well, yeah, sure, I know what the licensed product is. It's this. Yeah, well, you really got to pay attention to those words because you're only licensing what you're licensing. And it's, as Andrew and I always say, when we first have someone sit down in a conference room with them and say, hey, I want to talk about retaining you for my idea and building a company out of it. And they talk about the technology. Oh, this is the technology. This is what the technology does. We always say, often at the same time, what's your product? It doesn't matter what the technology is if you don't have a product, and you only license what you license. So the licensed product needs to be paid attention to. Your field and territory for a stem cell company and for a biotech company, it's almost always going to be global. You know, and if you're dealing with Elon Musk, it'll be Earth and Mars. You want it to be as broad as possible. And then the patent rights and the know-how I've already talked about, so I'm not going to really delve into that too much more. I also talked about the definition of net sales, which can be quite tricky in its detail. How sub-licensing revenue is treated. If you do that sub-license and you get all those different payments we talked about, initial payments, milestones, royalties, what percentage do you have to give back to the original licensor? And then how long do those royalties last? There should always be an end to royalties, in my view, in our view, for the company. And then also, this is something you really got to be careful about. And we represent one investor in a lot of these companies. And when you're looking at a company, part of that IP diligence I've talked about is how much royalty stacking is there. And so you really need, you can easily over time, like drips of water on a stone, wear the stone down. You get to the point where you're royalty stacking, all of a sudden you're paying a 10% royalty. And it's like that kills the value of your product. You want to be very mindful of that. And you have provisions in your license which cut off or minimize or mitigate the aggregate amount of the royalty that could be obtained through several licenses and licensees. And then also combination products. So, you want to be very careful. If your product, if your stem cell product is going to be in companion with another product, you don't want to be paying a royalty on the value of that whole product. You only want to be paying a royalty on the value of the combination, your segment of the combination creates. So that's a quick tour through the key considerations on a license agreement. And I think we may have one more slide, or no? No, we do. We have one more slide. It's our pictures. So, so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mike and see what he has for us.
Well, thank you, Andrew and Barry. Enormously helpful. I know for so many of the participants listening, you've given some great insights that will help them, and that you can then guide them through these things going forward. So let me raise a few questions. First, for stem cell therapies, what should companies consider regarding companion technologies? That you mentioned some of them for manufacturing, scaling, cell isolation, diagnostics, and assays. What are some of the key considerations there?
Yeah, so all of the things you mentioned, Mike, are tools that could, in combination with your base technology, give it increased commercial value, and really even more than value, access to the marketplace. Companion diagnostics is a great example. I mean, if you have a powerful companion diagnostic tool that would indicate the efficacy of the use of your stem cell technology, you've just done some priceless marketing for it. And so the question you need to be thinking about is all those technologies that surround your base technology is, how do I get them and how do I use them with my product? And so there are several routes. You can license them. If you're well funded enough, you may go out and buy a company or a technology that fits into your strategic plan for the launch of your product. You can partner. You can partner with big pharma or other biotechs. Or you could engage a contract research organization to research and bring that tool into your bailiwick. But one way or another, you're going to reach a point in your product development where you need to understand how necessary those companion technologies are and how you're going to bring them into your portfolio.
Great stuff. Important to think about. So you did talk a little bit about various kind of strategic collaborations and funding opportunities. I know you both, having been through the university system and working with various organizations, have some experience making introductions and bring companies to that. I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more detail about some of the, for regenerative medicine companies, if there are particular ones or areas in cancer that they might think about and at what stage they should start considering those.
Okay. Go for it. Well, there are specific ones. So it really, and Andrew, feel free to add into this. The first step in that process is understanding exactly what your product is and what market it hits. And then there are just a bevy of opportunities from non-dilutive funders out there, from state-sponsored funds like the Regenerative Medicine Fund in California to CPRIT. If your stem cell technology affects oncology, I mean, Texas has a $6 billion fund now to fund those opportunities. And there are some requirements, as I mentioned, about, you know, if for CPRIT, for example, you need to have some operations in Texas. You need to create some employment in Texas. Lots of companies have done that. You know, it's not that hard to do. California, less so, but that's out there. You've also got your traditional federal funders, NIH, National Science Foundation, those types of things, DOD. Andrew and I are working on an effort now. They've just announced, and I think it'll be operational maybe the end of this year, or maybe the beginning of next year, ARPA-H, which is DARPA for Health Initiatives. It's going to be a huge federal government platform to get in on nascent technologies and fund them in a non-dilutive manner. And then also there are the private foundations. So every rare disease, and some that aren't so rare, has a national foundation. I'm working with a company right now. I won't give away any confidentiality, but it's a rare disease. Their target is a rare disease, and there is a national foundation that all they do is they look for opportunities to fund people who are doing research and commercialization of technologies which could help the sufferers from that rare disease.
Yeah, and I would add, I mean, I know DOD has done funding of cell and stem cell therapies, you know, like bone issues, cartilage issues for like the warfighter. So DOD's mostly, it's focusing on the warfighter, whereas BARDA, for example, focus on the US population. You're going to see more of these kind of novel type of approaches in DOD in terms of their funding opportunities. Of course, Hogan Lovells has a pretty very deep government contracts group. And so I think it really depends upon kind of what your focus is. Like the nonprofits that Barry mentioned, you know, they are very active, and they've kind of taken a page from the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation 10 years ago, did a very large transaction where it sold its royalty interests in Vertex to a royalty acquisition company for over $1 billion. And so a lot of the nonprofits are seeing that model and wanting to replicate it. Barry talked about control. You are going to give up some control, whether it's, you know, operational control or the obligation to provide reports, spend your money in a certain way. If it's the federal state government, you have to, you know, be mindful of, you know, any False Claims Act issues. And so every investor or every funding source has its pluses and minuses. So
let me just mention one other thing to add to that. There is a lot of clinical trial funding out there too. So that's a little later on, but when you get to clinical trials for your therapy, there are regular equity funders and non-dilutive funders to get your clinical trials done at some of the best places in the world to get those clinical trials done.
And I'll just add, thank you. And I'll just add that Hogan, as Andrew mentioned, Hogan Lovells has a vast and deep government contracts group that can help you with some of the particulars of contracting with the federal government. We also have an education group and a lot of regulatory specialties, including healthcare, that can deal with a range reimbursement issues and many things that come down the road, as well as issues about international supply chain and dealing with anything that becomes a global issue. So I think this has been a fabulous presentation. Thank you both so much. Thank you again to the World Stem Cell Summit for this opportunity. And we really look forward to interacting with all of you. We welcome you to reach out to any of us and to other colleagues at Hogan Lovells for questions and opportunities. So thank you very much.